We've gotten to the place in Matthew where we're up to chapter 22. And we have this incredibly rich parable that Jesus is going to tell. It's actually the third in a series of parables that he has told in reference to the religious leaders after he finally gets to Jerusalem. This is the last parable before they begin to test him in the next couple of sections of Scripture. We're going to look at chapter 22, verse 1 through 14. It's traditionally called the parable of the wedding feast. It's an incredibly rich parable, but I had to ask myself as I was studying it, can this parable be applied individually? Can I look at it and just sort of put individuals in certain places in the parable and sort of apply it to them directly? I thought about that. I thought about it long and hard because the parts in it are so rightly applicable to people in our culture. But I had to answer the question, no, I can't do that. I would be doing a disservice to the passage. I have to apply it historically. Because I think as Jesus tells this parable, he is telling the parable in a historical context. So I can't apply it to you individually. I've got to apply it to us broadly. Okay? And what you're going to see, let me sort of outline the parable for you, because it's a wonderfully rich parable. First of all, Jesus is going to introduce the parable, or Matthew is. Matthew is going to say that Jesus is answering the religious leaders by telling them this parable. And then Jesus says in this introduction, this is where you get the idea, it's a picture. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven can be compared to. All right? So he is, in an indirect way, for those who have ears, he is illuminating the nature of God's kingdom in comparison or by way of a parable of a wedding feast that he says a king throws, get this, on behalf of his son. So the king is holding a wedding feast for his son, who is undoubtedly getting married. All right, everybody with me? But the reason for the wedding feast parable is to illuminate for those who have ears to hear the nature of the kingdom. Now historically, Jesus is telling it because the Pharisees and the religious leaders are undoubtedly misunderstanding the nature of the kingdom, right? And he's illuminating it for those who have ears, but in a real way, he's sort of veiling it for those who don't have ears to hear also. But we're going to assume that by the Spirit, we have ears to hear. Is that all right? We're going to make an assumption that we have ears to hear, and what we're going to try to discover is the nature of the kingdom of God, get this, not just personally, but historically, right? Not just so that I can see, or how did I personally apprehend the kingdom, but how does the kingdom become apprehended historically? All right, everybody with me? And so you get this picture at the beginning. The kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who holds a wedding feast for his son. Now, I'll tell y'all right off the bat that in the parable, the king who's having the feast is undoubtedly God the Father. Y'all would agree with me, right? And undoubtedly the son is Jesus. Y'all with me? That's pretty clear, right? But what is the wedding feast? What is that wedding feast, if you will? Well, some people have said that the wedding feast is the feast of the Messiah's banquet at sort of the end of time that people get invited to. Well, I happen to disagree with that. I think the feast is the kingdom. I think you get invited to the kingdom, right, by God the Father, and the Father's kingdom is for the Son. Now, I'll show you why I believe that in just a minute. But I think that's sort of the nature of the parable, right? And so he says the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast, he says, for his son. And then here's what you're going to find. There's a group of people, right, who have already been invited to the wedding feast, And then Jesus is going to tell you how they respond when the time comes to be called to the feast. Now, this is important. They've already been invited. The time is going to come to call them to the wedding feast. They're going to respond a certain way. The king will then respond to them. And then there's a second group of people who, get this is important, who hadn't previously been invited, but who will become invited in response to the first group. Everybody following me? Everybody see the outline, right? And then Jesus is going to give sort of a summary statement right at the end, verse 14. That's going to sort of bring the two together. So there's really sort of three moves in this parable, right? It centers on the first group who have an invitation, and the second group who previously didn't have an invitation, but who will subsequently get an invitation. Everybody with me? Now, here's why I say this is historical and not individual. These two groups are historical groups of people. They are real people groups. All right? And I want to show you this a little bit more in the passage. And at the end, I want to show you how this thing really did play out the way Jesus told the parable in history. And I want to sort of place us in the history timeline to see that when Jesus told the parable, before it ever happened in history, it began to happen just as he said it would when he told the parable. All right? Everybody following me? So here is how the first group unfolds. And I'll ask you after we've looked at it, who's the first group? Right? So think about that question. I'm beginning at verse 3. Here's Jesus' parable. Now keep in mind as you hear it, right, that Jesus is telling the religious leaders this parable. Verse 3 says, and he sent out his slave, this is the king, who is having the wedding feast for his son. He sent out his slaves, it says, to call those who had been invited. Grammar is always important in studying Scripture. Never underestimate grammar, because meaning of any sort of writing comes from the grammar. How do I know they already had an invitation before the call? The grammar says so. Do y'all see it? He sent them out to call those who had been invited. By the way, for all you grammarians, that's the perfect tense. That is the past event that had been completed. That's not kind of like the imperfect tense, which would suggest it was a past event that was in progress. This is a past event that had already happened. He went to call those who had already been invited. Are you with me? That's important, because the call comes after the invitation. The invitation went out. They knew the feast was coming, but they were just waiting to be called to the feast. Y'all with me? So it says that to call those who had been invited to the wedding feast. And then here's what Jesus says about them. He says, but they were unwilling to come. Now that just sounds odd to me. Okay, I can't quite figure out, because Jesus doesn't tell us, right? Why is it that they are unwilling? Okay, there's a feast going on. You undoubtedly have a relationship with the king who's holding the feast, because you got an invitation. But when the call comes, it says they're not willing to come to the feast. They're not willing to come to the wedding. Now, you know, if we were allowed to speculate, and we just can't ever tell if we're right or wrong, right? We're allowed to speculate. We just can't know for certain if we're right. If we're allowed to speculate, my first thought would be, you know, if I get a wedding invitation to somebody who is not really that important to me, I can say, well, I won't go. But if they're really important to you, you know you're going to be there, right? But Jesus says they're unwilling to come. But then watch this. Jesus in his parable, because all of these things illuminate history for us. He says, again, he sent out other slaves saying, tell those who, here's the perfect tense again, have been invited, behold, I have prepared my dinner. My ox and my fatted livestock are all butchered, and everything is ready. Come, he says, that's no longer a request, that's an imperative. Come to the wedding feast. Now y'all stay with me, because that part is important too. It communicates one thing. God has been gracious and called them more than once. He called them a second time and then gave them a picture of what they would enjoy if they just came to the feast. Right? So he describes for them what the wedding would look like. He said, my oxen, my fatted livestock, that's the livestock, that's not the puny meat, that's the rich meat. You know, only in a culture like America do we not like the fat part of the meat. Right? We prefer ours lean. You know, in some cultures where you need the fat to survive, the fatted calves and the fatted livestock are better than the lean ones. Right? But you know, when you can always go back to the grocery store, you can choose lean. But he says, my fatted livestock, they're all ready. They've been butchered. The meat is ready. And then he gives an imperative to them the second time, come to the wedding feast. Right? Now, I think that functions a couple of ways. One, it communicates that this first group of people, God has not been harsh with. He has persistently called them to the feast. He has made known to them the nature of the feast. He has communicated, listen, coming to the feast will benefit you. He has described the feast to them. And then look at verse number 5. Here's their response again. But they paid no attention, and they went their way. One to his own farm. My passage says farm. Some of yours may say field. He went to his own farm or field, and another to his business. And then it says, and then it turned ugly. And the rest seized his slaves and mistreated them and killed them. Now keep in mind, this is a picture of history to understand the nature of the kingdom. Remember from Matthew, the kingdom began when Jesus showed up and announced is here. Are you with me? So you almost get the impression that's the call of the kingdom. Hey, the son is here, the kingdom's ready. Come to the kingdom, right? But they've got other business they want to take care of. They didn't pay attention to the call, and they went on to their own fields and their own businesses. And some even responded harshly to the call, to the slaves who were sent. Now, verse 7 is going to say, and then the king is going to respond to them. But the king was enraged, and he sent his armies and destroyed those murderers, it says, and set their city on fire. Now, let me ask you all a question. I want you to think about this for a minute. Who's that first group of people? Who are they? Now, it's a question that I have struggled with saying directly, even on Sunday morning, because I know to a culture how it's going to sound. But this is one of those places where the preacher of the Word of God has to be bold enough to proclaim what we believe to be historically true. Who are those people? I think it's safe to say they're Jews. I think that's safe. Not only is it safe, I think it's right. That group of people are what Scripture would have called the covenant people of God. They got their invitation long ago to what God would do through his son. They were the people who had been waiting for the king's son to be wed. And when the call finally came, they were unwilling to go. I want y'all to let that sink in a minute. Now, here's what I mean. I could have very easily said, God, I could have applied this individually. I could have said, God's been calling you, and sometimes y'all have been unwilling to come. Y'all see, it would have been a natural sort of application, wouldn't it? I could have said the world, Pearland, God has been calling Pearland by the gospel, but they've been unwilling to come. But y'all would have seen how unhistorical it would have been, right? It would not have been true to the context. So watch this. Here, at verse number 8, sometimes summary statements communicate so much truth that you must pay attention. Look at verse number 8. Then he said to his slaves, this is the king, the wedding is ready. That communicates, it's, the redemption history is temporal. There are times where what God is doing comes to fruition. There are moments in history where God says, I've been waiting for this time, and this is going to happen because I have ordained this time to happen. He says the wedding is ready, but those who were invited, there's the perfect tense again, he says, were not worthy. Now, we got to understand this theologically, because my first thought, and I'm sure your first thought was, there's something morally wrong with the people, and that's why they're not worthy. There's something they could have done within themselves that would have made them worthy. Because the king says they're not worthy. Now, here is what you got to deal with first in just looking at the passage. According to the passage, what made them not worthy of the banquet was a not responding to the call. Yep, following me here? Simply not responding to the call made them not worthy to come. Now, this is one of those I had to really look at. I said, okay, actually, that statement I got from a commentary. And initially, I said, I don't know. And then I started looking at some reference scriptures. Here's what I mean by this is theologically important. You can be unworthy of the kingdom depending on how you respond to the call. Right? It has nothing to do with your inherent worth. It has nothing to do with merit. It has everything to do with how well you will respond to the call. Because, when Jesus sends out his disciples, right, and he sends them out 2 by 2, he tells them, go into the city, and anyone there who is worthy, he says, stay with them. And he says, anyone who is not worthy, shake the dust off. Now, that's in reference to what he sent them to say to those people. It's the same Greek word, haxios. It's the same word. It's if they receive you, then they're worthy. If they don't receive you, what do you conclude? They're not worthy. So when he tells them, the slaves, they're not worthy, it's not because they didn't have enough merit. Their rejection of the call says they're not worthy. Now, this is also another very interesting word, because the word is actually a word of measure. Right? At its root, it's a word of measure. It's if we put them in this scale and we put the kingdom in this scale, they don't move the scale. They're found wanting. They're not heavy enough. Are you following me? It's a matter of real worth. Here is the kingdom. The call is to it. They don't want the kingdom. And because of the small worthlessness of their lives, their thinking, they don't even respond to what could benefit them and their lives, suggesting that maybe they're not worthy of it. See, it's so really important. The things of God generally don't have much to do with your everyday lives, although people will try to tell you it does. They'll try to convince you what God really wants are all of the mundane things of life that you want. He is concerned about your field and about your business. That's the language of the passage, by the way. But here he's suggesting, listen, when the kingdom came, you went about your field, your farms, and your businesses, and you're missing out on the kingdom, and what it makes you is unworthy. They were unworthy of it. Not you, but them, by the way. I don't want to confuse. Not you, but them. So he says they're not worthy of the kingdom. And beginning at verse 9 then, keep this in mind, as a response to the first group, God is going to, according to the parable, or the king is going to welcome a second group. Watch. The goal, therefore, is there to communicate because of their unworthiness, go there. Y'all, that's important. That therefore is really big in redemptive history, right? He doesn't say they're unworthy. Okay, how about this? Go to this group. He says because they were unworthy, go to that group. Therefore, go therefore to the main highways, and as many as you find. See, there's an invitation. Invite to the wedding feast. Didn't say call those who had been invited. He said invite. You know why that's important? This is going to hit some of y'all like a ton of bricks. Because there was a time in redemptive history, not being a Jew, you weren't invited. There was a time in redemptive history when not being a Jew, you were without God and without hope of having him because you weren't invited. That's so very true and so necessary. Paul is going to say that later to the Roman church. He's going to say, listen, y'all need to know at one time you weren't invited. He's going to say that to the Ephesians too. That wasn't your privilege. You've not always had that privilege of being invited. Here's the other thing it suggests, right? Nobody gets in without an invitation. Nobody can earn a spot at the wedding feast. You got to be invited. That's important, right? You don't get God's attention and he say, hey, I think I want that person at my wedding. Look how good they look. Look how good they act. He says, I want you to go and as many as you find, invite them, he says, to the wedding feast. Those slaves went out into the streets, and listen to this. This is going to be so theologically profound. And they gathered together all they found, he says, both evil and good. He said, anybody out there who want to come to the feast of the king, you can come. You can be evil or good. And the slaves did this. They invited, right? And the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. Now, you would think that's a great story if we are all the second group of people. And I'm going to suggest to you that Gentiles, all non-Jewish nations, are the second group of people historically. When Israel as a nation rejected the invitation to the banquet, God then invited the Gentile nations to the kingdom. But know this, because I think this is true. By their rejection, you're in. If no rejection from them, you'd still be uninvited on the outside. On the outside. But I want you to notice something. Here's the question. So now, Gentile nations are invited in. Evil and good can come in. But here's the question. Do you have on wedding clothes when you get there? That's a curveball. This one took a whole lot of study. Watch this. But verse 11. But when the king came in to look over the dinner guests, he saw a man there who was not dressed in wedding clothes. And he said to him, notice his approach, friend, how did you come in here without wedding clothes? And then Jesus says the man was speechless. He had no response to give. You know, the no response indicates sort of guilt. You know what I mean? When you don't have anything to say, okay, you're just sort of red-faced. You're just sort of busted. Then the king said to the servants, in an odd twist, right? Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness. That's outside of the feast, by the way. In that place where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And here's that punch right at the end. Here's the punchline. For many are called, but few are chosen. He calls a lot, but he chooses a few. It's a parable. What makes the one man who's not in wedding clothes, I'm hesitant to say unworthy because I don't want to confuse it with the previous word unworthy. What makes him in trouble with the king versus all of the other good and evil guests who've come off the street?
The way he's dressed.
Yeah, the way he's dressed, but he called them from the street. He went to the highways and the forks in the road and said, y'all come to the feast. How many folks stand at the forks of the road and along the way in wedding clothes? Not many. How is it that a guy who's got on bad clothes gets kicked out and the evil person who we know is in there gets to stay in?
The evil person was ready for the banquet.
He was ready for the banquet. It's implied that when they got the invitation, they came ready for the feast, isn't it? It's implied, isn't it? When the invitation reached them, they said, hey, the feast of the king, let's go appropriately. That's what it sounds like, doesn't it? And then one guy came in, I don't think it really matters. I'll go in my jeans and my t-shirt. Suggests they understood the nature of the kingdom or the nature of the feast, and they showed up like it was a feast. They put two and two together, wedding feast, wedding clothes, because that's what you do when you go to some people come to the kingdom however they choose. Maybe we actually have to come to the kingdom the way the king chooses. Does that make sense? But here's what I want you to, here's where we've got to sort of bring the pieces together. We've got to sort of make the puzzle fit. There's good and evil at the feast, but the king is going to choose one who he won't let stay. And then Jesus is going to finish it with that one statement that says so much theologically that so much of the culture does not like. He's going to make that statement that's going to be a stab right at people's self-will, their own determinism. It's going to take salvation right out of the hands of the people, and he's going to say, because God can call a lot, but he only chooses some.
So what's the difference between invited and chosen?
It's a good question. It's a good question. Or an even better question, second question, what's the difference between called and invited? I think called and invited are the same. I know that because it's the same Greek word throughout. Context determines, right? Which one? They called those who had been, same word, invited, because it doesn't quite fit to say he called those who had been called. He called those who had been invited, right? So in other words, he invites a lot, or he calls many, but he only chooses from within the called. That's the part some people just don't like. It's theologically true. The gospel gets shared with a whole lot of people. And a whole lot of people will respond to it. But salvation doesn't come when you respond. It comes when he chooses. That's so very important. Listen, you can come before God and you say, look, God, I responded to the call of the gospel. And what happens if he says to you, but I don't like your clothes? Now, that's in the language of the parable. The parable is communicating the nature of the kingdom. And here's what I think Jesus is saying. Listen, for all of you in that second group who get invited to the feast, make sure you understand who gets in is still in the hands of the king. Who gets into the kingdom is determined by the king and not by you. Now, let's try to tie this thing historically. When the Jews rejected the Christ, the Son of the King, historically, when they rejected him, others, the slaves of the king, began to take the gospel, the call, to other nations. They were reluctant to, historically. The book of Acts records their reluctance. Y'all remember when we studied the book of Acts? You know, Peter had to get visions and he had to get sort of confronted by the king to say, no, really, I want you to go to the Gentiles. He said, hey, we've never done that kind of thing before. He said, I know it. Go to the Gentiles. Remember? And give them the call. And the call went out to all non-Jewish nations beginning in the first century. And it's been going out to Gentile nations ever since. That's why I'm so firmly convinced. There are folks who have, in their opinions, responded to the call, but who are not in. There are notionally Christian nations of people who have an affinity for the Son. But they're coming to the kingdom in their own chosen ways, leaves them on the outside. This is hard to communicate. I want to make sure I'm not suggesting that people get saved and then God rejects them. Make sure y'all know I'm not saying that. Are y'all with me? What I am saying is there are some people who believe they are, but because of how they come and because the king has not chosen them, they are not in. They're not in yet. I say yet because the king might one day choose them. Or they may be chosen and their time has not come. I'm trying to communicate some difficult things. But the reality is whoever is in, they're in because they have been chosen. Now, that word chosen is the same word Paul used in Ephesians and is translated elect. It's the same word Jesus uses when he says, if those difficult days had not been shortened, but for the sake of the elect. It's the same word. It's a word we who like to hold our destinies in our own hands don't particularly care for. It's that same word that whole sections of people who call themselves Christians say they don't believe in: election, predestination. Where would the Apostle Paul get this notion from that he would share with the Ephesian church? Where would he get that idea that there was a time when the Gentiles were excluded from the commonwealth of Israel? That's what he says in Ephesians. Where would he get such an idea? Where would he get the notion to go on to say, but in Christ now those who once were excluded have become included? Where would he get such an idea from? He'd be hard-pressed to go to an Old Testament passage and dig that out. Where would he get such an idea from? I suggest he got it from Jesus. The parable communicates what Paul would later be living in and communicated directly. Jesus communicated in a picture. So what does it mean for you and me? What's the takeaway for you and me presently, today? You live in a great era. You ought to thank God for the time you live in, because if you had lived in a previous time, you may have just been excluded. But by the grace of God, you and I live in an era, a time in history when we could be included. We have been invited. And listen, and if you are in, it's not because you chose him, because he chose you. The him choosing you makes you grateful to him. It makes the response of praise to him appropriate. Listen, if you came to yourself and came to your right mind and said, okay, I think God is the right way to go, and chose him, then you need to be applauded for your good decision. If he chose me, then he needs to be praised for his gracious choice. I think the latter is appropriate. I think every Gentile needs to understand that historically, that God is doing something in redemptive history that began. The kingdom was inaugurated in the first century, and you and I live at a moment in history, a moment in time where we have access to the kingdom if you have on wedding clothes. But y'all know, here's what the Apostle Paul also says. He says the invitation goes out to the Gentiles until the wedding feast is full. I'm bringing together two images. Jesus says until the wedding feast was full. Paul says until the fullness of the Gentiles have come in. What does this suggest?
Door's still open.
It's still open, but it also suggests it won't always be open, doesn't it? It suggests one day the invitations will cease, and all those who have come in, and all those whom he have chosen will be in, and then all those who have not responded, who have not been found worthy, don't get in. Interesting. I think y'all could probably handle this. Jesus also mentions that those who killed the slaves, he says the king sent their armies, and he killed those murderers and he burned their city. If this is historical, did that happen?
Yeah.
When did it happen? Happened in AD 70. Anybody know what happened in AD 70 historically? Jerusalem was burned to the ground by the Romans. It was. If that's historical. Now here's what I also found. Jesus then does not tell us what happens to all of that group who were unworthy, just to the some who decided to kill his slaves. But he doesn't tell us what happens to all of the rest of them. But Paul does. Did y'all realize that? Paul says when the fullness of the Gentiles have come in, he says then all of Israel will be saved. That's the ones who rejected. He says that God has given them for the time being a spirit of, anybody know the word? Stupor. Not stupid, stupor.
What is stupid?
It's that sort of, that semi-conscious, not really in your right mind state to be able to recognize what's obvious. He says, but that one day will be lifted. And Paul says it like this. For the sake of the Gentile, he says it like this. He says, so don't be arrogant towards them that you're in. You're only in because God has done it to them. And he says, you're just the unnatural branches that have been grafted onto their roots. And he says, if God will be faithful to you, he'll be faithful to them. And you and I are only in because God has left them out that you and I can come in. That's That's a picture of God bringing together Jews and Gentiles into one people, into one banquet. That's history. That's redemption history. That's the history of a whole lot of people who think individually never recognize. My hope is that what it will do for us is bring us perspective. You know what I mean by perspective? Perspective is not something you can use. It's not something you can apply. You can't use it like a tool. Perspective just helps you see clearly. And then everything else you do is in response to the perspective you have. Christians in the 21st century, Gentiles, need a historical perspective on where they stand with God. When you know you've been called, but you're not in until you're chosen, says that Christian people are never to be self-righteous. Y'all get my point? Listen, if there's anybody who ought to be a humble people with a historical perspective, it's supposed to be us. If you realize you might just be one of the evil folk invited and get to stay in, changes your perspective, doesn't it? But you know, it just kills me when I watch the people of God who are supposed to have the historical perspective become judgmental with other people for why they are not in. But, you know, we stand in judgment. You know, I don't know what's wrong with him. He just didn't, you know, he just didn't respond the way I did, kind of thing. It's supposed to change your perspective. Next week, we're going to look at what I like to call the tax trap. And I'm going to resist. I'm going to resist applying that one directly to us, too. I'm going to resist, because it's a real temptation to apply that to us directly. All right? So next week, we'll look at the tax trap.